All right, I think it's just 2 o'clock and we'll get started. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Mello. I see a lot of familiar faces in the little Zoom room here. But for those of you I have not had the opportunity to meet, I am the PI of the Injury Control COBRE. I am an emergency medicine physician. I've been practicing emergency medicine for more than 30 years. And for a little over 20 years, I've also been director of the Injury Prevention Center here at Rhode Island Hospital. And I'm delighted to kick off this initial event where we're going to kind of have you meet our new COBRE, our Injury Control COBRE. And for those of you not familiar with the COBRE, that's an acronym for Center of Biomedical Research Excellence. And we want to talk to you a little bit about what we intend to do within our COBRE. And we'll talk a little bit about the injury problem and why that burden of injury requires attention, requires further research. We'll talk a little bit about injury control, and as some folks sometimes get confused with that and its overlap with injury prevention. We'll lay out what our COBRE is going to look like, get you familiar with that, and also tell you about some of the resources we have to offer. We're going to end with a couple of our funded researchers talking about their projects, and these are some initial projects that we're starting with, but we will be funding many more projects as the grant progresses. So many of you probably have seen this table before. This is put out by the CDC every few years. And this one, I think, is probably from 2020 and uses 2018 data. But it's the leading causes of death, and they break it down by age group. And as you can see there, that unintentional injury is the leading cause of death for age 1 to 44. But it never really goes away. I mean, it's really still in the top 10 as we progress through life. And ends up being number 3 as the number 3 cause of death. And, you know, when we kind of, well, let me just go back to that for a second. That's just unintentional injury. The blue boxes, if you count in intentional harm, you know, the red boxes, homicide, the green boxes, suicide, you know, those numbers are even greater. If you kind of breaking down the unintentional injury deaths and how those occur, a lot of different injury patterns. You know, we see motor vehicle traffic deaths kind of up there in a leading spot for many decades, also unintentional poisonings, overdose, but a lot of different injury patterns happening here, not just one. And, you know, that's fatal injuries. Fatal injuries is really just the tip of the iceberg here. And when we, you know, when we talk about this, it's easy to talk about fatal injuries because we have good data on that. A lot of paperwork gets filled out when somebody dies, and we have some good records around that. But we all know that for every fatal injury, many more people are injured than end up getting hospitalized. You know, I, as an emergency physician, see many patients that are injured that never get hospitalized, but still have significant injuries. And some folks never end up in the emergency department. They go to their primary care doctor, they go to their orthopedist, still have injuries, still have consequences from those injuries with pain and loss of work or loss of school. And that all contributes to, you know, the societal burden of injury. You know, and if you look at those non-fatal injuries, we see, you know, in the red here, falls kind of as a leading player for what type of injury gets you to the emergency department. But we also see motor vehicle injuries also in there, as well as a variety of other injury patterns. So it's just not one, it's many different types. And this really kind of adds up to a significant financial burden. $4 trillion. And I know we hear a lot of figures coming out of Washington, dollars spent and all that. And I think we'll all agree that 4.2 trillion is a big number. And it's a number that, we would want to decrease. And, when you break it down, yep, medical care is a big piece of that. But then you look at the other pieces, work loss and quality of life, and statistically calculating out loss of life, because many of these injuries are happening to people early in life. So in differentiating injury prevention versus injury control, injury prevention, of course, we want to prevent injuries. We want to decrease the numbers on that chart. We want to decrease the cost spent. But injury control encompasses injury prevention and recognizes that, well, sometimes the occurrence of the injury cannot be stopped. But what we can do is we can minimize the injury when it happens. We can have optimal treatment of the injury when it happens, and we can prevent secondary injuries afterwards, and including optimizing rehabilitation care. And, injury control really just kind of builds upon the classic public health model of, defining the problem, identifying the risk and protective factors for it, developing strategies to prevent it or to minimize it, and then disseminating those strategies. But it really kind of takes injury from being thought of as an accident, as just kind of a single random event, but makes it thought of as a disease. We wouldn't think of diabetes or cardiovascular disease as just a random event that we would just kind of treat the consequences of it. No, we think of it as diseases, and we should think of injury as diseases too. They have, risk factors for when they occur. They have protective factors for minimizing their occurrence, as well as minimizing the resultant injury. And they occur in predicted patterns. So, we can use research to identify, injury patterns. We can use research, using epidemiology to identify our risk factors, to identify our protective factors. And then we can further use research to develop and test strategies that and find the successful one. And then we can use implementation science to disseminate those and implement those within our institutions, within our communities. They're not accidents, and we don't like to think of them as accidents, because accidents connote that they are fate, that they're, as I said before, random events. God's will, nothing could be done. Well, yes, something could be done. This graphic is from Disney, but there are no accidents, didn't come from Disney. Actually, I think my psych colleagues may recall that it actually came from Freud initially. There has been kind of a whole science that has been developing around this, that they're not accidents. Don't think of them as accidents. Think that they're not accidents, and how we can prevent injuries from happening. And about 60 years ago, William Hayden in the 1960s came up with kind of this matrix for figuring out how we can think about injuries and how we can control their occurrence. And he was the first director of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. He really was thinking about it with motor vehicle crashes, which was a significant injury burden then, still continues to be, but much more so back in the 60s and 70s. And he thought of, okay, if we take the classic epidemiological triangle of host, agent, environment, can we think of things to do before the occurrence of the injury, at the time of the occurrence of the injury, and then after the injury? And, we could use research to find out what works and then disseminate those findings. And sort of what he did. I mean, it continued for many decades after him. It's things like, we found out that, to prevent crashes occurrence, we can work with the host, the driver, and do driver's education. We can, modify the car and have anti-lock brakes to hopefully prevent the crash from occurrence. We can modify the environment and put those little rumble strips on the side of the road. So when I'm driving home after working an overnight shift and start to get drowsy and drift to the side of the road, those little rumble strips wake me up, and that's to prevent the crash. But even during the crash, we can have airbags. We can have those water-filled or sand-filled cylinders in front of concrete embankment. So when then a crash occurs, that absorbs the energy instead of the driver's body. And also we can, after an event, we can have a system in place, a trauma system in place to provide optimal treatment for the treatment of the injured, including a trauma center like here at Rhode Island Hospital. And, to come up with those strategies, we frequently use the 4 E's, economics, or can we have financial incentives or disincentives to get folks to modify their risk? And education, can we either do one-on-one education or can we do education throughout the community? Also engineering, can we make products safer? And or can we modify the environment to make injury less likely to occur? And also, of course, enforcement strategies, and whether that's laws or policies to keep our community and our environment safe. Unfortunately, though, trauma research has historically been underfunded. I mean, if you recall those initial slides, third leading cause of death, it gets nowhere near the funding that the other causes of death in that top 10 get. Only 3.7% of all NIH grants. And this is relatively recent data, 2019. Actually, in today's New England Journal, there's a nice perspective piece written about this, written how we should really kind of think of almost trauma as a chronic condition, because so many of the things that result from trauma have lasting effects, sometimes lifetime lasting effects, but certainly they should be thought of as a chronic disease, much the way we think of our other chronic diseases like diabetes or cardiovascular disease. But also they make the point, there really should be an NIH center for trauma so that we can have more research done in this area. But, that's why we were thrilled that NIH decided to name us, a center of biomedical research excellence around injury control. And we just received this award in April. It's a 5-year award, $12 million. We're thrilled that it's really the first COBRE to focus on injury control. And, that's kind of a broad topic, but also gives us a lot of flexibility of what we want to do and who we can work with. Now, if you remember at the start, you said that, I said that we've had an injury prevention center here at the hospital, and I've been running that for the past 20 years. That has kind of a 3-part mission. We do community outreach. We do, well, pre-COVID, we were doing anywhere from 75 to 100 community events a year. We do education, both with our trainees here at the hospital, as well as, through our partner institutions at Brown, at the medical school, at the School of Public Health. And we've done research. I mean, we've had our level fundings, R21s, R01s from the NIH, from CDC, from foundations, but those were all project focused. What this COBRE allows us to do is build a research infrastructure to bring people into injury science, develop them into independent researchers. And as I said, we're not going to just focus on one injury patents. We're looking at many different areas of focus. We really want lots of investigators looking at all different types of injury patterns, regardless of whether they're for children or adults or older adults. Here's a little graphic about how our COBRE is kind of laid out as a org chart. We have an administrative core. We have two other cores, an injury control digital innovation core, as well as an injury control research to practice and policy core. And you're going to hear from those core directors in a moment as they explain some of the work they'll be doing. And we have some other folks advising us, and we have projects that we will be helping usher along. Our internal advisory committee are Rhode Island Hospital injury leaders, and they will help connect us with other resources within Rhode Island Hospital, within the community, so that we can leverage our resources with theirs. We have a community advisory board, partners in the community who are working in their injury space. And we want to make sure that we're listening to them, that we are recognizing what they view as the most important injury patterns, that we're doing injury research that's culturally appropriate, that we're utilizing some of the resources they have in their at their disposal, maybe data they have within their organization, and also they will help us in disseminating our findings. And we have an external advisory committee. These are 4 nationally known injury researchers, variety of different areas of focus, childhood injury, digital health injury, firearms, epidemiology, a lot of different areas that they can assist us with in moving our COBRE forward. In our administrative core, we have a grant funding program. We're going to be giving a couple of different types of grants that I'll touch on in a minute. We're also going to be having lecture series, bringing in national people on injury control research. We're going to have some dedicated mentorship for our grant recipients. We're going to be running a grant writing seminar to help those folks get their first R-level grant. We also have data analysts expertise, as well as we're going to be doing kind of a robust evaluation to make sure that we're meeting the objectives that we've set for ourselves. So our research funding, it kind of comes in kind of 2 different levels. One is research project leaders. Those are 3 spots that we have, and they are funding 50% of the researcher's effort. We will do that over several years, and it's really to get those people transitioned into getting their first R01. We have competitive rollout of applications for this. As one person gets funded and gets their R01, we will recruit another person into that slot for a research project leader. In addition to that, we have pilot project funds. We have $50,000 in pilot projects funds. I should say $50,000 awards for pilot projects. We have over $800,000 that were designated to give out. And we had a call for pilot projects very recently, and we hope to award the first round of those in the fall, but we'll have many subsequent rounds to get some folks some pilot project money to start them on their injury research. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay for a little bit here as she talks to us about her research to practice and policy core. And Lindsay, I'll advance the slides for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to tell you all about the research to practice and policy core of our injury control COBRE. We're calling this the RPP core. And as many of you know, research in injury prevention and control takes years to accomplish and disseminate, which really does lessen its intended impact. And sometimes it can even make our research out of date. And so the rapid translation of emerging research findings into practice and policy is especially important in the field of injury and trauma patterns, given that the trends and etiology of trauma can often change rapidly. Risk of injury is also ubiquitous across the lifespan, and it's necessary that we're translating our research findings into various practice settings for multiple groups. As such, our Injury Control COBRE Research to Practice and Policy Core is seeking to equip researchers with the tools to tailor their study methodologies and also have a series of tailored dissemination strategies in order to have an accelerated impact on clinical practice and policy. We have a number of faculty who are affiliated with the RPP Core who have significant experience in translating their research findings and technology developments into clinical practice and policy. All right, next slide. I'll tell you a little bit about how the RPP Core accomplishes this goal. Broadly, we provide robust infrastructure of methodological support to facilitate injury control research moving forward into clinical practice and policy. We also hope to create systems to train injury researchers to rapidly and effectively disseminate their research. First, we offer a seminar series that's designed to facilitate the design and implementation and dissemination of sound injury control research. This series includes online trainings as well as in-person training modules, as well as seminars with a more hands-on style learning. Some focuses include a seminar on bridging the research to policy and practice gap through community-engaged dissemination implementation science research. Also a series on causal inference for policy and practice implications. Another series on patient-centered injury constructs using administrative data. And also another series on evidence synthesis for shaping public policy and practice. In addition, our researchers also have the opportunity for one-on-one consultations. Some areas of expertise include stakeholder and community engagement, implementation science, research using electronic health records, large patient databases, injury coding and mapping, functional quality of life outcomes and causal inference, as well as evidence synthesis. We also provide several experiential training opportunities because we really believe that a community-based approach is going to strengthen an investigator's network in their specific field. And it also gives investigators the opportunity to extend their research expertise into various community practice and policy settings. As such, research project leads have the opportunity to participate in community advisory boards, engage with various stakeholder organizations, attend policy meetings, join work groups, and also work with other community-based technical assistance activities. We also recognize that communicating scientific findings effectively outside of our scientific community can be challenging. In our training, not many of us have the opportunity to have hands-on experience in media training. With this in mind, the RPP Core aims to equip research product leads with health communication skills, offering trainings in visual representation of data, more specific media training, seminars, for example, on presenting your research story to a non-scientific stakeholder, and also importantly, how to build your social media engagement in order to more effectively disseminate your research. Next slide. Lastly, the RPP Core also is the home of an injury control warehouse, which we are building to house online resources that provide tools regarding injury constructs, as well as open source programming code relating to injury science research. This warehouse houses links to public access injury control data sources and will also house de-identified data from COBRE projects that can allow these data to be utilized in future projects. Also in the injury prevention warehouse, we include data sharing agreements. In addition to these activities, we also hope to foster additional dissemination opportunities for the research project leads. These include engagement in local symposium, working with mentors to create customized dissemination plans, and also working with RPP directors and community advisory boards to determine the most appropriate ways that their research can be disseminated. For example, to different biomedical, business and policy audiences, as well as public audiences.
All right. Lindsay, maybe I could just ask you for 10 seconds just to tell everybody a little bit about yourself too. I should have at the outset, but maybe you could just give them a quick overview of yourself.
Absolutely. So I am an associate professor of research in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior within our medical school at Brown, and also a clinical psychologist and staff psychologist at hospital within Lifespan Physicians Group. My
Great.
link here to this COBRE is that I'm a violence prevention researcher. So I've linked in through several CDC-funded projects to do school-based violence prevention research. And I have a real passion for making sure that we're doing research in practice settings and also understanding how our research can be better communicated into practice and policy settings.
Great, thank you. Kirsten?
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm Kirsten Langdon. I am also an assistant professor of research through the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown. Like Lindsay, I sit in the Department of Psychiatry at Rhode Island Hospital. I'm a practicing clinical psychologist. And I also recently stepped into the position of the Associate Director of the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health. So I am the Assistant Director of this core in collaboration with Megan Ranney, who is the director of this core and also the director of the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health. And so in terms of the digital innovation core, really sort of the core aim is to support COBRE affiliated investigators by creating a really systematic pipeline for people to be able to develop, evaluate, and deploy technology delivered tools that can help in the prevention and control of research. Next slide.
There we go.
And so I know that there's already been a bit of background presented here today about injury control and how that might function for the COBRE. But I did just want to spend just a couple of minutes talking a little bit about injury control and the particular relevance of digital health for this field. And so as one sort of example of how this might work, many of you here on the call today are familiar with hospital settings and emergency departments. And many of us look at this as being, an area for acute illness or attending to emergencies or these sort of spontaneous events that occur. Next slide, please. But as we know, healthcare systems don't act in isolation, and they're not just this one point of contact for an emergency, but rather they serve as a way to sort of liaison individuals for other resources and supports that they may need. So they may serve in the role of being involved in day-to-day preventative care, identifying sort of problems or risk factors, linking people to appropriate resources, and hopefully helping to support sort of overall whole body health. Next slide, please. So in this way, we really hope that coming into an emergency setting or a hospital setting ends up being sort of a conduit to other services and care, and that we're not just sort of serving as that front door approach, but rather assisting patients in that overall journey. Next slide, please. And I think this is where digital health really has the opportunity to come in and be impactful. And so let me start by just defining digital health. When we talk about digital health, this is really just referencing any form of kind of novel technology that allows us to deliver healthcare in sort of a new setting. So this might be a diagnostic tool, or this could be intervention focused, but digital health is just a way for us to increase access to evidence-based services. Next slide. As seen here in these statistics, digital health is quickly making an impact on the United States. We know that more than 85% of Americans own or have access to a smartphone, with 97% of individuals having access to a text messaging feature. And in this way, digital health really has a profound opportunity to impact the way that patients are receiving desired services that can both impact their mental health, physical health, and overall have an impact on injury control. And so the Digital Health Innovation Core is really excited about being able to leverage technology in a way that impacts overall injury control. So next slide, and I can tell you a little bit about how we're going to do that. So I know Allison Seeley is here today on the call, but through the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health, we already have an existing and robust set of seminars that occur monthly that really focus on the development, evaluation, and deployment of digital health products. And so our goal is to begin to integrate some of these seminars that will really take a focus on how you can utilize digital health innovations to help support research around injury control. So that will be sort of an ongoing aspect that allows people to get a broader range of kind of tools and understanding of digital health technologies, particularly in the sphere of injury control. Next slide. We'll also offer one-on-one consultation and support. Some of the areas that we have some increased levels of expertise are around design and evaluation of digital health products, utilizing clinical intervention research and methodologies, looking at privacy, security, and ethics, particularly as it relates to digital health and how that might be important as you deploy a digital health intervention. One of the areas that is particularly close to the mission of the Center for Digital Health is around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so consultations can also help to think through some of these challenges in the very beginning or outset of developing a digital health tool with the goal of increasing access to different populations and ensuring equity over time. And finally, we know that, across research, there tends to be this bottleneck where digital health gets stuck in sort of the research domain, and we really want to see it impact real world experiences. And so one of the consultation areas is how to commercialize your product or deploy it in real world settings so that it has the intended impact and reaches the populations that it's intended to serve. Next slide. And finally, one of kind of the cornerstones of the Digital Innovation Core will be to establish a pipeline innovation program. We anticipate that this will launch sometime next year, but this really represents an intensive mentorship and training program that will kind of guide people through the overall development and deployment process of a digital health product. We believe that this will occur over a 6-month period of time. It will include twice monthly structured seminar series that are then augmented by one-on-one consultation and support. In collaboration with Lindsay's core, we hope to really emphasize how to commercialize the products and deploy it in real-world settings so that, again, there is this aspect of making sure that it is integrated into a real-world setting and has that intended impact on injury control over time. Thank you.
Great. Well, as I said, we have 2 folks that we're currently funding that we submitted their research projects with the original application, and they have both started their projects recently. The first is Stephanie Roost, who is a pediatric emergency medicine physician. Stephanie, are you online?
I am on phone, so I'm sorry, I'm working clinically, everyone, so I don't know if you can see my face or hear me.
Can you see the slides?
And thank you to everyone for joining. I'm sorry that these are suboptimal conditions, but hopefully you can all hear me, and hopefully there won't be too much overhead noise from the emergency department. But my current project is aimed at deriving a clinical prediction rule for pediatric abusive fractures. You can go ahead. So to give you all a little bit of background, as some of you might be aware, unfortunately, child abuse and neglect are fairly ubiquitous occurrences in children's lives, and it affects nearly 1 in 7 children. Also, fractures are really one of the most common abusive injuries that we see in general after skin and soft tissue injuries such as bruises. And so obviously fractures are an important abusive injury for us to be able to recognize and diagnose appropriately. There is some difficulty with identifying abusive fractures, though, because there's a lot of overlap between unintentional or accidental fractures and abusive fractures. Can advance. And there are also some limitations in recognizing abusive fractures beyond the fact that there's overlap between accidental injuries. A big limitation in our recognition of these fractures is our implicit and explicit biases related to sociodemographics that come from the providers who see patients in the emergency department or in clinics. And there's lots of literature to show that certain minority groups are much more likely to be flagged for potential abusive injuries and reported to Child Protective Services. Additionally, another limitation is that while we do have many excellent pediatric hospitals and emergency departments across the country, about 75% of children with injuries are actually seen in general emergency departments. And while they do receive excellent care there, most of these providers are actual general trained providers and are not pediatric specific. So they may not have the subtle or more detailed training as it relates to identifying pediatric abusive injuries and understanding some of the typical development that can go along with children. So the big gap that exists right now is that there's really no validated clinical decision rules that exist to help clinicians, both in general and pediatric emergency departments and clinics, to help identify high-risk fractures for abusive injuries in children that can actually be utilized in real time while providers are seeing patients. So our aim for my study is to derive a clinical decision rule to help identify fracture presentations that are highly concerning for abuse among children less than or equal to age 5. And so we'll be doing this by using the Hasbro Children's Hospital EPIC database, both of emergency department encounters, as well as our child abuse clinician database that keeps a running tally of all of the children who are evaluated for abuse, who are diagnosed with abuse, or maintain high suspicion for abuse. And why is this important? I think, because this is such a common issue, child abuse is a common issue, and the fact that there's high risk for more serious injuries and long-term consequences for children, it's really important for us to be able to identify these high-risk injuries and then have a clinical decision rule that can be used in real time and that can be validated across a variety of different patient cohorts across the country, including large national research registries that currently exist. Our ultimate goal is to decrease the cases of missed abusive fractures, and also to decrease that implicit and explicit bias that goes into evaluation and recognition of child abuse. And so not only can we have direct benefit to the children who are being seen going forward, by utilizing this methodology and developing a clinical decision rule, but also if we can demonstrate that our methodology is successful, we can use this to apply to other potential abusive injuries. So I'm not going to get into the details of the methods because this could be an entire lecture or course on its own. But needless to say, we have some computer science experts who will be assisting me. And basically what we're doing is taking the full text of all of the patient encounters and using some complex machine learning techniques and natural language processing, where we're able to pull out key terms and phrases from provider notes as well as radiology reports to try to hone down on the most important parts of patients' histories, exams, and injuries to identify those high-risk features in our young children. We'll be looking initially to develop a machine learning model by using children seen in our emergency department from 2014 to 2020. And then we'll refine that model by comparing our results to the results of our child abuse specialists and their complete workup and evaluation of these children with fractures. We can go through and adjust our model to increase how sensitive we are at picking up these injuries. And then we can go forward and test this model again on another cohort of patients to see how good we do when we apply it to a completely new group. So currently we have onboarded a PhD computer science graduate student who will be helping us with the machine learning along with his mentor. And we are in the process of working closely with our research IT group to acquire the full text reports from all of our emergency department encounters. So we're hoping that within the coming weeks to month or so, we'll start to have all of that data and we can hit the ground running with starting to develop our model to identify these high-risk fractures. Thanks,
Stephanie. Thanks for joining.
Welcome.
I know you're in the middle of a busy clinical shift. Next, Leslie Brick is going to give us a quick overview of the work she's doing.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here and to be a part of this really awesome COBRE. So my study is a prospective study. It's a really long title, a prospective study of post-traumatic stress symptom development in cannabis use among trauma-exposed injured emerging adults following ED discharge. And the basis of this work is really to understand some of the overlap between what we see in elevations of cannabis use among people who report trauma exposure and PTSD. So we know that the body's endocannabinoid system, which is one of our biological systems that plays a role in regulating things like stress and memory, and many other biological systems, show alterations following trauma and PTSD development. We see enhanced sympathetic activation, we see physiological arousal, we see overconsolidation of trauma-related memories. And given that cannabis use involves the exogenous addition of these cannabinoids in our system, I'm interested in learning more about how this overlap between cannabis use and development of post-traumatic stress symptoms, especially PTSD, can help us understand this high-risk period following a traumatic event. We also know that people with PTSD often report self-medication with cannabis, and not just people with PTSD, but also people who are just exposed to trauma and are injured. So we know that medical use of cannabis is often reported among people who have pain, sleep, and PTSD issues. So a lot of times people are self-medicating, and especially during this very critical period right around discharge from a hospitalization or right after trauma exposure, it would be great for us to understand a little bit more about what's driving use and what might be risk factors for development of psychological and other problems later on. You can go to the next slide. So our study has two overarching aims. One is to examine the dynamic relations between post-trauma symptoms and cannabis use during this acute post-trauma period, which we're defining as essentially the 4 weeks after they're discharged from the emergency department. And we want to understand are people's real lived experiences every day throughout the day associated with increases in use? And do we see alterations in physiological measures like heart rate that might coincide with post-trauma symptoms? And does heavier chronic use sort of alter those associations? So we really want to take a deep dive in people's daily lives. Why are they using cannabis? Is it helping their symptoms? And what's happening physiologically within that time period? Our second aim is to look at longer term outcomes. So if people are reporting that they're using for cannabis for treating their pain or their sleep or just helping them feel better, do they actually feel better? Does it actually help their pain long term? So we have a 6-month follow-up in which we will be looking at whether their symptoms are improving over that period of time. Are people who are using more likely to develop stress-sensitive outcomes like PTSD or depression, anxiety? And are there associations between these symptoms, post-trauma symptoms, and cannabis use for those who are self-medicating? So the design of our study is to catch people at the time of trauma, essentially when they've been admitted to the emergency department. And this is a really critical element of the study because many current research projects are asking people retrospectively about trauma exposure. So this is allowing us to really catch them at this very high risk critical period right after they've been exposed to an injury or a trauma, and as they are kind of being discharged and going home from hospitalization. So we'll be recruiting 100 young adults between the ages of 10 and 25 who report being regular cannabis users. And eligible participants will have experienced DSM-5 criterion A trauma with an acute qualifying physical injury. So that just means people who have experienced some sort of threat to their life or well-being, like interpersonal violence, assault, motor vehicle crash, falls, etc. When they are discharged from the hospital, they're going to go home with a Garmin smartwatch that basically it passively collects heart rate data, ambulatory data, and various other sensors that will monitor them for 4 weeks. It's paired with an app that we'll download on their phone that will ask them things about how they're doing throughout the day, how they're sleeping, how much pain they're in, what sorts of post-traumatic stress symptoms they're experiencing. And we're also asking them to log every time they use cannabis, what they're using, how much they're using, what the CBD THC content is, and that sort of thing. After that 1 month period, they'll come back to our lab and we will ask them some follow-up questions about other things going on in their lives. And then they'll return again for that 6-month long-term follow-up. You can go to the next slide. So where we are right now, we have started finalizing our recruitment and enrollment procedures in the ED. We have hired a research assistant and are going through some training to get up and ready to do some of those interviews and interface with the participants. We're currently in development and programming of the EMA surveys that we'll be using and testing the smartwatch data collection. We're finalizing the baseline and follow-up surveys, and the big piece that we're waiting for is this final IRB approval. The other kind of catch with my study is that I did submit an R01 kind of based on this idea, and it is currently pending funding from NIDA. It received a really good score. And we are just kind of waiting for that to hopefully come through soon. It builds on this project by also integrating some lab-based follow-ups to assess fear learning, fear response and learning. And we're also going to collect some physiological biomarkers in the ED.
Great, thanks, Leslie.
And I just want to thank everybody on this screen because it wouldn't have been possible without them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so Leslie's our first success. Already looks like she may get our level funding. You know, we have a few minutes here at the end, and I wanted to answer any questions that anyone might have. Of course, you can always email me any questions, mjmello@lifespan.org. Also a little plug for our Twitter feed here. We're at Injury COBRE. We will have a website soon. We're working with Lifespan to get that out. Can I answer any questions for anyone, or can any of our other COBRE leaderships or investigators answer questions for anyone? And please just unmic yourself. I have a limited view and only can see a few people on here, so just unmic yourself and shout it out if you have a question. Maybe I can stop sharing here too. Brendan, I see your hand up.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to the presentation from the Injury COBRE today. So my name is Brendan Jacker. I work at the Brown School of Public Health and also with Lifespan Bird Core. And so I know I work with many folks across Lifespan and Brown, and my question is whether there's a restriction to physical injuries as a kind of inclusion criteria, or whether you're open to, say, psychological injury or trauma. It's just more of kind of to clarify for other people.
Yeah, good question, Brendan. And interestingly, you know, I had a slide at the outset to define injury, and it defined the physical causes of injury, the transfer of energy, and it was the kind of usual definition of transfer through chemical, electrical, mechanical means. But I kind of took it out for that very reason that, you know what, we're not just interested in physical injury, we're interested in injuries beyond just physical injury to the body. We certainly know that injuries can have consequences, immediate consequences, as well as lasting consequences, even if they have minimal physical harm. So the short answer is yes, we're very open to any type of injury research.
Great, thanks very much.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Comments? All right. Well, thank you, all of us. Thank you, all of you, for joining us to let us tell you a little bit about our COBRE. We will be contacting you in the future as this kind of comes together. Right at the end of this, Julie Bromberg, who is our COBRE administrator, is actually going to send out a quick poll through Zoom, right?